Hi everyone, thanks for attending this morning. My name is Suzanne Linnane and I'm the Education Sector Representative at Uformishka, or the Water Forum. So while some of you will be very familiar with the Water Forum, some of you will be new to our work, and the Water Forum itself was set up under the Water Services Act in 2017, to advise the Minister on water policy. We, as a Water Forum, represent many stakeholders with an interest in water resources, including industry, agriculture, environmental and community organisations and individuals. We're hosting this webinar to help inform thinking in regard to the development and implementation of the next River Basin Management Plan. So the Water Forum itself recently completed our new strategic plan, and that's setting out our work in the context of the current environmental crises. According to experts, we have approximately 10 years to prevent catastrophic climate change. Human activities are causing the sixth mass extinction of species, and our water resources are under severe stress globally. And then to top it all off, we are living through a global pandemic. It's likely that's going to have significant impacts on our lifestyles going forward. So what we need to think about is the fact that our current lifestyles and consumption habits are unsustainable. So while we can have very little control on a global scale, on a local scale, we can make a difference. The webinar today is seeking to explore what structures, what policies and processes are needed to facilitate action at local level for possible environmental outcomes for water, for biodiversity and for climate. The recent Central Statistics Office survey shows that 79% of Irish households, for them, water pollution is their greatest concern. And for 73% of those households, they're supporting stricter pollution controls. So many of our attendees here today are employees of the state who have a key role in implementing policies to protect our natural environment to achieve Ireland's environmental objectives. So to achieve the objectives for biodiversity, climate and water, the Water Forum itself, we really believe that communities, businesses and individuals need to be empowered to make the necessary changes in their homes, in their workplaces, and that communities need to be empowered to protect the natural world that we all live in and that future generations depend on. So we're very fortunate this morning to have experts willing to share their time and expertise with us. And I think you're going to agree that both sessions are hugely interesting. Session 1 will introduce the forum's policy recommendation that integrated catchment management should take account of climate, of soil and biodiversity outcomes in addition to water. And the academic research that we're going to hear about on the value of participative and deliberative democracy approaches and best practice in public participation, you'll find hugely interesting, and they'll be presented in our first session. So session 2 is going to explore then how communities have been supported to take action at local level to protect the water while also improving biodiversity and heritage. So we really hope as a forum that the webinar will identify what further structures and supports are needed to facilitate individuals and communities to make the changes needed to address the current crises. Now, just to note that we're going to let all the speakers in each session finish, and there'll be a panel discussion at the end of every session. Your questions and any contributions that you want to give, you can submit in the chat box. And there's also an upvoting system. So if you like a particular question, you can vote for that and have it move up in the order. There's also a pop-out box that allows you to view the resources and the agenda, and there's a full screen function, so you can see the whole screen view at any time. And the other thing is there's also a poll question, so please do take advantage of that during the break, and we have the answers or the results of that poll at the very end. So without further ado, I'm going to start with our speakers. And our first speaker today is the Communications and Education Lead for Uformishka, the Water Forum, and it's Gretta McCarron. Now, Gretta has worked in the forum for 2.5 years at this stage, but prior to that, she worked as a community water officer. And Gretta has almost 20 years experience in environmental education in schools, in universities and in local communities. So Gretta is going to introduce Uformishka's, or the Water Forum's policy, which is the framework for integrated land and landscape management. So over to you, Gretta.
Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to present the forum's policy, a framework for integrated land and landscape management today, because it is an approach that could be used in the development of the 46 catchment plans that have been proposed as part of the new River Basin Management Plan, third cycle. So what is the Framework for Integrated Land and Landscape Management. It's a new approach to landscape management, and it's a systems-based approach. That is, all of the components of the natural environment are included. That is, air, water, soils, and ecosystems are considered in a landscape catchment-based approach. So it allows for the interlinkages and interdependencies of these environmental spheres. But it also allows for the inclusion of society's needs, that is the needs of today and those of future generations. That means it also means that the actions that will be defined or undertaken can be cohesive, holistic, and more integrated. So why do we need an integrated approach? There have been a number of new international policies, such as the EU Green Deal, the Farm to Fork strategy, the new CAP policy. We have the Water Framework Directive and the new River Basin Management Plan, the Biodiversity Strategy, Habitats Directives, and we have a number of Irish policies underpinning all of these to achieve certain environmental outcomes and objectives. So why should we use a river catchment as the unit for environmental management? The Forum have defined the river catchment as a multifunctional, topographically based, dynamic, multiple scale, socio-biophysical system. It includes overground and underground hydrology. It connects land, water, ecosystems, and people. It provides a basis for environmental analysis, management, and governance. The film approach, or the film policy, builds on the current approach of integrated catchment management, but it includes a systems approach, that is, so it's more of an integrated systems approach. This is a schematic diagram to show a river catchment and the ecosystem services that's provided by a river catchment. We have atmospheric system services, including wind energy, solar energy, and rainfall. Our geosystem services include groundwater, pollution attenuation, aggregates, minerals, oil and gas, geothermal energy, recreation and tourism. Our ecosystem services include surface water, habitats, food, timber, air quality, water purification, pollination, soil formation. And we also have spiritual elements within the catchment as well, and recreational opportunities. This new approach will have definite benefits, but it will also have challenges. For the environment, it will have benefits for water quality, ecosystems health, soils, and climate, because they'll all be considered together in an integrated approach. It will have benefits for communities, because communities will be included in the process for their health and well-being, but equally for a sustainable economic activity and for recreation. The challenges are the fact that mostly, traditionally, organisations work in silos. That is necessary because we have specialisms within organisations, specialist knowledge, specialist policies, and these will lead to specialist outcomes for the environment. But sometimes that can result in limited outcomes and has the potential for inefficiency and ineffectiveness. The Framework for Land and Landscape Management aims to address some of these challenges. So it will address the interconnectedness of the natural system. It promotes less siloed management. It aims to achieve positive environmental outcomes in all of the realms to ensure the compliance with EU directives and national regulations. It will identify the synergies that can be achieved for maximum efficiency and effectiveness, and it will allow local community involvement. The vision for film is a systems approach that requires multidisciplinary, multi-objective, multi-stakeholder engagement so that it supports a balanced evaluation of all of the relevant issues and allows for the development and co-creation of solutions and action plans. The schematic diagram again to show the whole of catchment approach. So it's a whole of environment approach. It's catchment-based landscape management. It requires multi-stakeholder engagement for strategic environmental outcomes. Atmospheric systems, geosystems, ecosystem services are all interconnected and interdependent. That means that they need to be managed in an integrated manner, with agencies working together to maximize outcomes and actions. Catchment-based community involvement is key for social and economic well-being and for positive environmental outcomes. So this is the approach that's recommended for the development of catchment visions or catchment plans using the film approach. So throughout in this diagram, you can see throughout the process, stakeholder engagement is happening. The process begins with a stakeholder vision. So communities and stakeholders contribute to the vision for their catchment, and that allows the identification of challenges, local challenges and issues on the ground. A desk study is carried out to identify the status of the water body. Is it in meeting its EU Water Framework Directive objectives? If it is, it needs protection. If it's not meeting its EU Water Framework Directive objectives, it needs improvement or restoration. So depending on what the status is, the actions will be different. So for protection, the idea is that throughout the process, that when the actions are being identified, that consideration is given to greenhouse gas reductions, to carbon sequestration, and to the benefits for biodiversity. So actions are identified, they're agreed, they're prioritized according to their benefits for all the environmental realms. Once the actions are identified and agreed, they can be implemented. The stage 5 and stage 6 is an evaluation. So once they're implemented, the process is ongoing, they need to be evaluated so that there's an assessment done to how effective those measures are. And if they need to be changed, so be it. Changes will have to be made. So the idea is to identify the co-benefits for carbon sequestration, for greenhouse gas emission reductions, and for biodiversity. The film approach for water and biodiversity protection should result in more strategic and effective implementation of the habitats and water framework directives. So the stages, again, include the integration and prioritise in catchments for water, biodiversity and climate. So stage 1 is the community vision and the desk study. Stage 2, catchment characterisation for water and ecosystem improvement or protection with the pressures and issues identified. Stage 3, catchment actions are evaluated and prioritised for positive environmental outcomes for water, biodiversity and for climate and soils. So the idea is that we get the right measure in the right place. Stage 4 and 5 is the plan development, implementation and communication around progress. Stage 6 evaluates and measures the progress and so that it can be adjusted if the outcomes are not being achieved. So in summary, integrated catchment management is the core approach and philosophy underpinning film. But film reconfigures integrated catchment management for wider environmental protection and enhancement. Can be used for the protection and management of habitats also, such as special areas of conservation. Stakeholder and community involvement is required throughout. It explicitly includes consideration for and co-benefits for the co-benefits of biodiversity, carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emission reductions. It encourages environmental policy coherence and integration. It encourages interdisciplinary and multi-organisational collaboration, and it discourages silos. It takes account of synergies and trade-offs, and it provides the basis for a shared vision for land and landscape utilisation and management. And it can be used in the development of the 46 catchment management plans proposed in the draft River Basin Management Plan. This proposal is based on the work of the EPA catchment units in delivering integrated catchment management over the last number of years, and with input from Donald Daly and the work of the members of the Water Forum. Thank you.
Thanks, Gretta, for that presentation. And just a reminder to everybody that questions and contributions can be submitted in the chat box as you go along. Our next speaker is Patrick Bresnihan, and Patrick is a lecturer in the Department of Geography at Maynooth University. Patrick works across the interdisciplinary fields of political energy, science and technology studies, and environmental humanities. He's published extensively on a range of environmental governance topics, including fisheries, water infrastructure, and energy across his career. His book, Transforming the Fisheries and Neoliberalism, Nature and the Commons at University of Nebraska Press from 2016, won the Geography Society of Ireland Book of the Year in 2018. And for today, Patrick is presenting on best practice in public participation. Over to you, Patrick.
Great, thanks, Suzanne, for the introduction, and thank you to Gretta and to the Water Forum for the introduction to talk today. So what I'm going to do in 15 minutes, which is quite a short amount of time, is try to cover a kind of I guess, a body of work which I've been developing since about 2017 around water governance issues in Ireland. And that work has been collaborative for the most part, so working with Ariel Hess and James Merricks, particularly, on 3 projects that were funded by the EPA, by the Irish Research Council, and by the Water Forum. And I guess that work is all available online. And if people want to get more detail on what I'm going to cover today, please go and look at those documents. The main one being the desk study on public engagement in water governance, which I wrote for the Water Forum with Ariel Hess a couple of years ago. And what I'm going to present today is largely taken from that document, which is a kind of a synthesis of a literature review. It's also based on our own field work and sort of qualitative research over the last 4 years. Okay, so to begin with, what is public participation? It's a big term. It crosses a number of disciplines, political science, environmental management, sociology, geography. So there's not one definition of it, but in our reading, we came up with a few ways of characterizing public participation, I guess. So these are just a number of those points. The first one is that public participation, while broadly supported by state stakeholders, so that would be departments, local authorities, state agencies, may be supported by those bodies, but it's not necessarily determined by them. I guess the flip side of that is that it includes communities and citizens, non-citizens, and other sort of stakeholders, but it also operates beyond the local scale. And we'll come back to this point when I talk about scale and context. It isn't just about kind of a localized community engagement. It's more than that. The third point is that public participation is not just about raising awareness amongst the population. It's not just about encouraging behavioral change, which tends to be an emphasis, I think, on certain quite simplistic, understandings of participation. It also includes a commitment to social transformation that very often involves dissent and disagreement. And I think about an example of the last sort of 8 years in my work where there has been, the most intense or visible forms of public participation around water. And I think you can think about the anti-water charges movement and a lot of the debates that surfaced around questions of public or private water management, whether there should be water charges or not. I mean, that is is a clear example of a form of public participation that I think, when we just limit it to, river basin management and so on, we might neglect that is a form of public participation. The fourth and fifth points are kind of normative points. So public participation in water governance is not just about improving water quality. It's also about facilitating democratic practices. So enhancing ownership, equity, participation in decision-making. It is also, even though it's statutorily required, Ireland within the EU, it goes beyond that to sort of justice principles, so ideas of trying to enable more just and equitable decision-making and environmental management. So those are some of the kind of main characteristics of public participation. Now what I'm going to do is sort of hone in on these three pillars or principles, I guess, of public participation that we unpack in the desk study, and also provide some case studies which help sort of highlight some of the best practices and not so good practices around equity, expertise, and scale. Okay, so I'm just going to run through these quite quickly. So equity. Equity is, or inequity, is the idea that there are differences in the power, resources, and authorities that individuals and groups have to begin with. So this is important because if we go back to what Gretta was talking about there, this idea that we want stakeholders to participate from the beginning of, say, river basin management. But the question arises is, who's there at the beginning? You call a meeting, who turns up at a meeting? At that kind of granular level. At a bigger level, who participates in setting policy? Who has resources to carry out campaigns, to lobby? Who has skills in articulating their views? Who has the time to turn up? There's professionals who are paid to turn up to engage in consultation. These are questions of equity. And the difference or the importance of equity is if we compare it to equality. So we often hear about equality of opportunity. Equality is the idea that we're all beginning from the same place. Equity is that we recognize that we are not starting from the same place. And so in order to encourage or sort of foster public participation, active steps need to be taken to remedy that inequity. So like in this cartoon, the boxes are put in to allow the smaller kid to stand up. And so when we think about that in the context of water governance, often, and this is in the case of Ireland too, there's an assumption that there are win-win scenarios or everyone can be part of the process. And that sort of jumps or can obscure the fact that there are quite significant power imbalances to begin with. And if we don't recognize those imbalances, it can actually lead to people being turned off, people feeling like, what's the point? The same people, the same groups are going to get their say. What's the point in turning up? So it can lead to a kind of a mistrust and an apathy. And the example that we looked at in the document was around the Murray-Darling Basin. There's obviously been a lot of conflicts over water. And the big issue there is around agricultural interests. So it's a big agricultural area and there's a strong agricultural lobby there that is able to sway decision-making, or at least that's the way it's perceived by groups that have protested around that. Okay, so that's equity. The second pillar is around expertise. So again, Gretta has made this point that we need to get beyond silos. We need to think about multiple forms of expertise. I think in thinking about expertise, we should also get beyond the idea of accredited experts or professional experts. So people who are non-accredited, so just citizens, people who go about their business, who don't have qualifications, also have expertise about the places where they live, the environments that they engage with, and the water. And in order to bring that expertise into decision-making, we can't just say, oh, they have local knowledge, that's great. Again, we need to think about what active steps need to be taken to elicit that expertise and bring it into a meaningful way into the decision-making process. And so what we talked about in the document there was about how there's a lot of recognition of local knowledge, about how it's valuable and how it's worthy to include it. But more often than not, local, as it's called, or lay knowledge is considered additive to scientific analysis. So the science comes first, and particularly physical sciences, is the priority. And then after that, there can be local viewpoints or local knowledge brought in. What we are calling for, and what the literature calls for, is that there needs to be a greater democratization of science. So that means there needs to be a kind of an idea that there are multiple forms of expertise that have equal sort of value in the decision-making process. And an example we looked at was a participatory action research project in the Lewins River Trust in the UK around catchment management that was very effective at this, and involved actual methods, so methods around community mapping, workshops, and another method, which I'm just going to quickly mention here because we used it in one of our projects, around autophotography or photo voice. And so this project, we went to 3 different catchments. We got groups of non-certified experts, of farmers, anglers, just local residents, to go we gave them disposable cameras. We told them to take pictures of what they thought affected the quality of water in the places that they lived and worked. We got the photos developed, and then we interviewed people and talked about the photos. We published this book, had a few exhibitions. And what became clear from this is just how rich the understanding is of people, the people have about landscape change, about policies, about how policies impact local environmental change. And this particular one is a photo of poor slurry practice. You can see there on the left. It's taken by a beef farmer who admitted it was poor slurry practice. It was on his field. But over a period of 10, 15 minutes, talked about the difficulties, the pressures that a part-time beef farmer is under, the way in which contractors that do the slurry spreading employ seasonal workers, so students during the summer. They're paid by the hour. They don't care so much. A very complex set of economic, environmental, social, cultural factors that are really affecting things like slurry spreading, which obviously affects water quality in a place, which you don't necessarily get, by, say, a catchment scientist going down to that place who has their specialized knowledge, or even a sociologist going down there. You talk to the people there, and they have this kind of situated, rich analysis of their own situation. Okay, just finally, the third point about scale. This is I think an important one, is that, particularly in the context of water governance in Europe, or since the Water Framework Directive, there has been a scaling down to the catchment scale. There can be a tendency to focus on the catchment as one scale of action, decision-making, responsibility. But we know that actions and decisions taken beyond the catchment have a huge impact on the catchment. So how do we recognize that there are multiple scales working in catchment management decision-making? And how in public participation can that be brought into account? I'm going to skip over this quickly, but just to say that, if you engage with people on the ground, very often what they say is, what's happening on the ground is because of economic policies made elsewhere, because of funding made elsewhere, and because of planning policy. And I think just because it's in the news recently, it seems apt to kind of include this here. It's recently, been talked about at an EU level. Ireland lags very much in terms of the ability of actors, environment, NGOs, communities to participate in planning and decision making. And that is the context in which a lot of the River Basin Management Plan is going to unfold. And there are moves to sort of reform the Planning and Development Act to make it even harder. And that is part of the context we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about catchment management, because people involved in those activities will more often than not know about these things. So why would they get involved in certain types of initiatives that might be beneficial if they think that the system is rigged, that in fact, there's more and more avenues to participate are being closed off at a scale that counts. Okay, very finally, these were our last points, recommendations in the document about to consider in Ireland's approach to water governance. Maybe we can come back to them in the discussion. I think that they repeat some of what Gretta has said and some of what the other speakers will say too. Okay, I'll leave it there. I hope that's some good food for thought for the discussion.
Thanks, Patrick. And yes, absolutely, indeed, plenty of food for thought there. And everybody, just a reminder about the Q&A and chat box contribution. So our next speaker is Alexandra Revez. And Alexandra is a senior postdoctoral researcher in MARII, the SFI Research Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine. She's a practiced academic with expertise in human geography and community development. Her recent collaborative research work with the Imagining 2050 project, it's focused on democratic innovation, co-creation, leveraging collective imaginations, and engagement with communities on issues linked to climate action in Ireland. So Alexandra is an external expert advisor with the Teaching Council and a member of the Enabling Societal Transformations JPI Climate Action Group. So Alexandra is going to introduce the Deliberative Democracy Toolkit that was developed as part of the Imagining 2050 project. So thank you, Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'd like to start by thanking everyone that is here today and for the Water Forum for this great opportunity to share our work on the Imagining 2050 project and to reflect on how some of our findings and tools might be useful when we think about water, biodiversity, climate action, and indeed catchment management. Just as background information, as Claudia said, the Imagining 2050 it was a multidisciplinary project funded by the EPA and co-funded by SEAI. The project has actually technically ended last year, but there's still a lot of ongoing work, including our final EPA report, which should be out within the next few weeks. And the project was led in University College Cork by Gerard Mullally, and we had great contributions from other partners, including Queen's University, Belfast. So what we're doing today, sorry, I'm having a problem getting my slides to move. So what we're doing today is showcasing some tools that we explored in the context of deliberative processes, and we tried to make these tools more inclusive in the sense of something that's not restricted to academia or to the national decision-making process, such as the Citizens' Assembly, but also tools that are equally valid for the regional and the local scale, and particularly for different groups and organizations, including local community organizations, environmental activists, local decision makers, educators and researchers, and social enterprise partnerships, among others, just to make this form of approach more democratic, I suppose, in a sense. So I suppose the idea then is to showcase the work, and I've rated some of the tools that I'm going to go through. These are very practical tools. We rate them in terms of ease, how many resources might you need? What do you need to sort of consider if you would like to replicate the process? So just to re-emphasize, I suppose, the rationale that Claudia has done a very good job in introducing, there are different ways of thinking about decision-making and participation. And within this space, we actually see a lot of innovations drawing from deliberative approaches for a number of reasons. One of them is that, more direct forms of democracy, such as referenda, has encountered some problems in terms of people actually having access to information and having considered, the information from different points of view when they're making their decision. Also, in terms of representative democracy, turnout at the ballot is actually, decreasing, and there's a sort of problems there. So deliberative innovations has become very important in this context, and not just the fact that people should be heard in the process as well is an important fact. You shouldn't just have people in the room, but also that they should be involved in terms of access to good quality information, to consider the views of others, and to emphasize not just the here and now, but also consider the future in terms of decision making. So the tools that we used were used to co-create visions and pathways towards low carbon and climate resilience. And we used these in two communities. The first one was in Athlone, which is a hub of activity in the Midlands. And the second one was in Ballincollig, which is a fast growing residential area in Cork City. We had a third community planned in Lahinch in County Clare, but unfortunately, because of COVID, we had to cancel these events. These were two weekend-long events where we, the first event included a lot of visioning exercises and a lot of visioning and information giving sessions, and the second one led more to developing pathways and towards some decision making. The critical thing here is that none of these tools are innovative in themselves. You know, we didn't invent the wheel here. What we were trying to do is actually introduce these tools within a deliberative process in the sense that there's an emphasis on good information giving, there's emphasis on the consideration of other people's points of view. So you're not just aggregating, people's opinions, you're actually actively considering the views of others, and also you're considering the future as well. So moving on with the first tool that we used, and this was empathy mapping. And we use this to promote dialogue. The emphasis here, I suppose, and when I mentioned, considering the views of other, empathy mapping is a very good exercise in terms of stepping outside your own experience and considering, a problem or situation from the views of others. So we had groups looking at young people, farmers, families, among other groups. So we kickstarted the empathy mapping exercise with Doodle Lab, which consisted of a very informal showcasing of doodling techniques that could be used, in the process. And I suppose, it was a sort of a start to make people more comfortable maybe with doodling. And, doodling can be a barrier for people in terms of drawing and communication and in doing that in a very visual way, but it can also be very helpful, particularly if we're trying to consider, in detail actions and initiatives from other people's perspectives. So I'm just showing this example here from our event in Ballincollig. And here we have Alex, which is an imaginary 8-year-old, and we're considering their daily routine, their needs, their immediate priorities. And people would have developed these characters in groups, and they were giving them names. They were, they would have presented this to a room, drawing on opportunities for further debate as well. And I suppose, in terms of the deliberative process being seen as a conflict resolution, considering the views of others can be a very important step in that direction. And it's not so much the end stage of conflict resolution, but the need and the value of deliberation to increase thoughtfulness, to increase our understanding of how others might feel and the needs of others. So moving on with another form of mapping, and I'm glad that Patrick also mentioned this in his own presentation. We thought that mapping was a really important process, and it was very useful within the deliberative process as well. It is an accessible and easy way to raise awareness of issues that consider, for example, different risks in the community, develop a shared understanding, and possibly start deliberating on some of the solutions as well, and consider different roles and agency and responsibilities of various actors. I think one important point, just very practical in terms of trying to what you can achieve from maps. You might consider what is the best type of map for your own purposes and for your own deliberations. So we took a little bit of time on this, is it a street view or a very detailed view of a particular, section of a river, for example, if we're talking about water? Is it a bird's eye view, where you can get a bigger picture? We're talking about catchment management in this stage. Is it a combination of both? Is it a wider panoramic view, to consider wider forces and issues? So we decided for a bird's eye view. We made a bespoke map. We had a great graphic designer to help us here. We decided to actually strip out a lot of busy information from the map to allow people to actively engage and place in the map things that they thought were important and significant. And actually the maps turned out to be quite a resource for the communities where we did these exercises, and people went and took them away. You know, they used then the maps to do exercises in primary schools, secondary schools, tidy towns, youth clubs, things like that. So it was a great resource for the community. And from our own point of view, we decided to use the map on the visioning stage. Thank you. We decided to use the visioning map for the first stage of the presentation, or the visioning event, and then in terms of developing pathways. So what we did was people visioned, you know, what they wanted for their community in the future, and we put all of these together into one map, and we said, right, if we needed to do this tomorrow, is this what you want? And so there was, you know, further deliberations, and there was an opportunity to tweak and to revisit some of the decisions being made. So that's just one of the examples then, a neat sort of, you know, formatted example of the exercise that we did in Ballincollig. And there's some interesting things there in terms of water, flood prevention, recovery of the floodplain, and, you know, wildlife corridors, etc. So just moving on very quickly, we also had audience polls, which were quite useful in terms of bridging expert-led insights. In this instance, you know, we had energy modelers with us, and leading to a discussion on future-oriented choices, and we could actively model people's decisions in the room, and how could that help us, you know, reach particular targets. And for this particular exercise, we used a smartphone app called Slido, so we could see people's, you know, choices in a screen, and then we could model these into the future to see what impact that would have in reaching some of the targets that we need to reach in terms of climate action. So that's just an example there of the exercise that we did. And then for a final exercise, it's funny that, you know, I started the presentation talking about how we need to move beyond the ballot box. Well, we did indeed use a ballot box. And I suppose this, you know, really stresses the value of the process, is that people now are making decisions, they're going to the ballot, but, you know, they've already undergone a process where they've considered the needs of others, they've considered important facts and information, and they've considered the future as well. So now is a time for making decisions. There's various ways in which those decisions can be made, and some of the steps are there. For the sake of time, I'll run through these a bit quicker. I also, we considered in our toolkit the fact that deliberative engagements might be, you know, important to do online. We did ours face-to-face, and, you know, in itself, it's very important. I think one of the key one of the key messages here is that if you're going to do this online, it might be easier in terms of reaching out to particular groups and people that are time poor, but you also need to ensure that, you know, these events are shorter in time and maybe more frequent or something like that, because the deliberations that we did, for example, a full weekend, you know, it's impossible to request that of people online. So just to say that we have a number of resources available, and I've shared the links there. And to finish up by, you know, showing the team behind this work, and thanking everybody, and look forward to the questions and answers. So thank you very much.
Okay, and thanks, Alexandra. Again, hugely interesting. And as we said with Patrick, again, lots of food for thought. I'm going to invite all the speakers back, and we're going to start our Q&A session. And there's a lot of interest and a lot of really good questions and comments coming in here for the speakers. So I think you're probably going to be busy in this session. But while that's been organised, I might just start off with one question. And it's something that both Gretta and Patrick alluded to. And I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on what you mean exactly. And Gretta, maybe you might start this off by breaking down the silos. And Patrick, if you want to come in, and maybe Alexandra and Claudia, you might have an opinion here as well. So I'll leave that one with you guys.
Yeah, thank you for that, for the question. I think the film approach is taking a landscape-based approach, and it means that if you're going to address all of the issues, you need all of the experts working together. You know, traditionally, catchments would be managed, you know, you had different groups, agencies working in different areas, like you'd have the National Parks and Wildlife Service, they'd be responsible for habitats and biodiversity. Local authority and the EPA might be responsible for water quality. And then you'd have, you know, Inland Fisheries Ireland, you have all these different agencies involved. You'd have Chagas and the Department of Agriculture, you know, taking a lead on soils. So when you're taking a landscape-based approach and engaging with communities, you kind of need all of these agencies working together with the communities to resolve issues and to identify solutions and to agree solutions with the communities, so that the communities are engaged in the process. So it's happening. I think, you know, the breaking down of those kind of silos is happening already in the regional operational committees that are developed. They work primarily, all the agencies work together to identify the measures that need to be implemented in the PA, the priority areas for action. So it is happening at a regional scale. But I suppose if we're going to engage with communities at catchment level and at water body level, it needs to happen also at a local scale. So that's where all the different experts in the local area will be engaging with the communities to answer the community questions around what the issues are. It's about bringing in that expertise so that there can be shared expertise to develop solutions, like Patrick was saying, you know, so the approach, everybody can agree what the priorities are for a particular issue within the catchment, and it can be addressed that way. In even within local authorities, you'll have specific expertise as well, like you have the biodiversity officer, you'll have a tourism officer, you'll have, you know, the community water officer, all these different officers for different parts of the catchment. So it's about trying to get everybody working together to find the solutions. I think that's what breaking down the silos is at local and regional scale.
Thanks, Gretta. Patrick, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, that was a great answer. I guess the only thing I'd say to that, I mean, so the silos, there's multiple different silos. I think what Gretta talked about there was around the kinds of jurisdictions almost, you know, local, national, regional, the different agencies involved. You know, as an academic, when I think about silos, I think about it more in terms of disciplines and the kinds of methodologies and assumptions and perspectives that different disciplines bring. And I think, you know, within the physical sciences, there are silos between, say, biology and ecology and chemistry. And then between the physical sciences and the social sciences, there are differences, big differences, then social sciences and the humanities. And then you've got another set of silos, which is in terms of expertise, which is the non-certified expertise that I mentioned in my talk. And I think in terms of, you know, what I was trying to get at is that very often other forms of expertise are kind of added on in a tokenistic way. And there tends to be a hierarchy of expertise. So sort of the physical sciences are the top of the hierarchy, then social sciences, then arts, humanities, and then kind of local knowledge. And it really would take a radical shift to try to get beyond that kind of hierarchy, and the way in which it's not anyone's fault, but it's very much sedimented into the institutions and the ways in which we go about things. And to try to rectify that, it will take, you know, one thing I would say, it takes a lot of time. You can't just magic away these big differences that have sedimented over a lot of time. It takes a lot of time, and that brings us into questions of funding. So, you know, if you're going to have a project, you need time to develop understanding across different perspectives. You know, it's not going to happen in 6 months or whatever. So, you know, then we start getting into the kinds of mechanics of it. But I know there's lots of other questions. So
there are a lot of questions, which is great. Claudia or Alexandra, do you want to add to that before we move on? Or
I don't really want to add to it. I completely agree with the other two answers, and I'm conscious there are a lot more questions. And for me, I was thinking more so as an academic around disciplinary silos and research practice. But yeah.
Super. Thanks everybody. Now I'm going to start with some of these are quite long, but I'm going to call them out as they appear here. Gretta, this one is very much for you. It's in relation to the film approach, and this person says it's certainly interesting, but they're wondering which agency is responsible for its implementation. That public engagement in running a project program on a catchment scale is very labour intensive, and local authorities, for example, do not have the necessary staff or financial resources to deliver a film approach. Is the idea for voluntary local community groups or rivers trusts or central government departments to coordinate these catchment projects? Now, I know there's a lot in that question.
Yeah, there is. And I suppose what my thinking or the forum's thinking on it is that, you know, we are in an environmental crisis at the moment. So it does require everybody engaging to resolve that particular, the issues that we are facing currently. It's 2022. We have a lot of objectives to achieve, major objectives to achieve by 2030. So if we really mean to take action and achieve those for water, biodiversity and climate, we all need to work together. And I think that's what the film is saying. You know, we need that integrated approach. So it's not for the local communities on their own, and it's not for government on its own or the agencies on its own, because it's not a problem that can be solved by any one of those particular groups. It has to be everybody working together. And I think that's what needs to happen. And it's about how are those structures going to be put in place to make that happen. Now, there is work going on. The communities are doing excellent work, and we'll see about that in the second session, you know, but it's about what structures need to be put in place to support communities. What sort of expertise needs to be leveraged to allow that to happen? You know, there is, if we are to engage with communities at catchment level, that will require, as they said in the comment there, that will require further resources for the local authority to do that. I know there's a review of local authorities going on at the moment. It'll be around what sort of training needs to be provided. How will that be facilitated? How will it be worked out? How will plans that the communities come up with be integrated into local authority work programs? All of that kind of thing. So all of that has to be teased out, I suppose. And but I do think it's all the different agencies working together with the community and with local government, with the government supports.
Thanks, Gretta. I'm sure that's addressed the question. Patrick, there's another long one here for you, but I'm going to call it out as well. Public participation, co-creation, co-decision making, supporting communities to deliver projects on the ground, etc., etc. These are all well and good, but this person fears that those in the community who have their own day-to-day jobs and who volunteer their evenings and weekends to working on these issues. Are we asking too much of communities when they aren't paid for their time or supported in terms of core running costs? And the final part of this question is, what does equity look like in practice, and does it address these obstacles? It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd agree with all of it. I hope that was the kind of the gist of what I communicated in my talk, was that with equity, it's exactly those things that question is asked about. It's you know, who can participate? And I think it also relates to something I was getting at with scale, which is that, as I said, going back to the Water Framework Directive in 2000 and the longer history of shifts in water governance and environmental governance, there has been a tendency to imagine that communities can take responsibility for these vast problems that we face: climate change, biodiversity loss, water quality, when in fact, I think what we heard on the ground talking to people very often is, we want to, you know, even those who wanted to get involved, we want to, but what we can do is a very small amount compared to what can be done if policies are changed in terms of land use, in terms of agricultural policy, in terms of planning, in terms of investment in wastewater infrastructure. And I think that's why I think that's important in the context of this discussion, is that, you know, when we think about catchment management and public participation catchment management, you can't go into that already assuming that this is the scale at which action has to take place, at which responsibility is allocated. There has to be space in any kind of consultation with communities where they point the finger back and say, this isn't for us to manage, it's for, you know, politicians, it's for governments, it's for shifts, you know, further downstream. And I think I think that's quite difficult, because that's kind of, again, beyond the remit of, say, LawPro or other agencies that are involved specifically in catchment. But then how do you deal with that response? You know, I'd say that probably it's about linking up with other kinds of initiatives, you know, whether that's, you know, environment NGOs, platforms around public participation, you know, which are trying to change the kind of broader context. But yeah, that's a relatively short answer to that question, but I agree. I think that those are very valid concerns and questions.
Great, thanks, Patrick, for that. Claudia, I'm gonna go to you. There's one here asking, do you feel that the current PPN or the public participation networks are working and have a role?
Well, that's again a really good question, and I have to confess I'm familiar with the public participation networks and some of their works, but certainly they have a role in the sense that they bring stakeholders together. They're involved in a participatory process embedded within a particular level of democracy in a particular system. I wouldn't see myself as sufficiently expert to give a broad brush evaluation of all of their work. I think they have an important part to play in that wider, I suppose, vibrant democratic ecology. And it kind of comes back to some of the ideas that have been discussed here, really, in that if we want to take a more holistic approach to, I suppose, to governance, to democracy, and particularly to democracy around issues around climate mitigation, there are different roles and different roles within the system, or there needs to be the creation, I suppose, of different spaces within the system to allow different forms of participation. And how to network all that together, I suppose, can be a challenge in a way that speaks to those points of inclusion and equity and considered judgment. So, as I said, from my knowledge of the PPNs, they certainly have a part to play. There is deliberation within the PPN, certainly within the ones that I am most familiar with myself. But again, I think it would be unfair to expect them to, in a solitary sense, to deliver all the solutions. I think that there needs to be they themselves need to be embedded in wider systems that are more participatory and more arguably deliberative as well. So again, I suppose hopefully it came across from the 10 minutes or so presentation that what is being proposed are ways of trying to reimagine or to strengthen existing practice, and maybe to reimagine exactly how institutions themselves relate to one another and actors and agencies relate to one another, but recognizing too that this is all done within kind of limited resources. Yeah. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Claudia. That's great. Alexandra, there's a question here for you. It's a nice one, actually. Do you think the tools you have applied for climate change could also be used for catchment planning for water and biodiversity outcomes?
Absolutely. From the discussions that we've had on the ground with people, and we've tried to apply the tools elsewhere into different contexts, I can see that, they would be able to draw out some interesting new insights, the empathy mapping, the community mapping, the audience poll surveys, and the value of these. And I suppose to go back to some of the questions in terms of, how you can include people, the value of these is that when you do a deliberative process, you're in essence, having a microcosm of a particular community, and you have it in a representative way. The Citizens Assembly does this through random sampling. We chose a different process. We actually actively looked for people that are, different in the community, try to profile the community and get people from different backgrounds. It wasn't always easy and it wasn't perfect. We had issues with representation, but we tried that. So when you have the sort of variety in the room, actively discussing and actively considering the views of others, and then you sort of try and hold a vision of the future together, taking that into account, that's very powerful, because that tells you that, okay, we considered the views of others. We considered what farmers feel and think and what they need. We considered, what anglers feel, think and need. We considered children and amenities and tourism. And this is what we think, considering everything, what should be done. And I think this is where sometimes, when you think about silos and stuff like that, you bring in an expertise, but, you're leaving a lot behind if you don't go through this process.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick, another question for you. It says, question for Patrick, would appreciate further thoughts on how to address this constant pushback by successive governments on access to participation in planning and essentially non-confirmation with the House. Attempt to limit access in 2019, and we see repeatedly, whether with judicial review bill or other legislation, attempts to limit public participation.
Yeah. That's a big question. I don't know how far you want to go back. I did see something about, in the current context of what I mentioned with the criticism from the EU about Ireland, yeah. He had mentioned that he was surprised that a country in Western Europe would have such, a poor record, not just on sort of environmental outcomes, but specifically on public participation and the role of environmental NGOs and the ways in which they were sort of excluded from decision making and so on. And I think that actually, this is maybe going a little bit off tangent, but I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Ireland is quite different to other European countries. And a lot of our development over the last, particularly since the 70s, has relied on the one hand, expanding agriculture. It is the sort of the basis of our indigenous economy. And on the other, attracting foreign direct investment, which often has quite a large infrastructural footprint or pollution footprint. And so, that's the crux of it. And, that's why it's so contested and why it is so controversial. And time again, we see the history of rural environmental politics is often about communities trying to resist these projects, which undermine, their livelihoods, undermine their health, undermine their environmental quality. And I think that in terms of addressing that, you're talking about having to address very big questions. And I think for that reason, it goes beyond the remit of simply, or beyond the silo of simply catchment management, simply water governance, and, relates to a whole set of other things around Ireland's sort of model of development. So those would be my observations on it, which are,
That's great, Patrick. Thank you. And I'm conscious of our time, and there's an awful lot of questions coming in for everybody. There's huge interest in all the talks. So we might have to come back to some of them maybe, later after it. But I'll just try and get in the time we have left, I'll try and pick out some that relate to everybody. Gretta, there's one here. There's actually a few here in relation to film. So there's a lot of talk and chat around film. But one of the things that is being asked here in regards to film, you mentioned that film could be used at the catchment scale. So there's 46 catchment plans. Is there opportunity in trialling this approach at the micro scale in areas where local communities have capacity and willingness to get involved in their local catchment?
Yes, I would think it is a great opportunity for a catchment association or a catchment group who are already well established in a catchment to trial this approach, absolutely, and engage with all of the agencies and to see how effective it is. It would be a great starting point, and it could be a case study then for other catchments to follow suit, and the learnings could be shared. I think that would be a very, very good approach and should be encouraged, definitely.
Okay, thanks, Gretta. Jesse, so let me see, so Claudia, for you, it says here that you've said that deliberative processes can't stand alone and need to be embedded in the wider systems. Can you give an example of how that would need to happen in relation to water management in Ireland? You're just on mute, Claudia.
Yeah, sorry, my mouse froze on me for some reason. I suppose so embedded in a way that there would be, I suppose, an official response that there would be, and that I suppose in some ways what Gretta was mentioning earlier on was that at the end of a process that there was this evaluation and so there was implementation and evaluation of the process, and that would be that would feed into other iterations of the process. But within water catchment management, so within that, I mean, it would be embedded into the authorities that there would be a specific response. I suppose I present myself here as more so an expert in the processes than the actual subject area itself, but really what at the heart of any deliberative process should be a commitment to respond to those who have been involved in the deliberations. If that isn't given at the beginning, then why are you asking people to participate? Why are you asking people or agencies or stakeholders to come and deliberate? And in fact, that's when you move into the realm of tokenism. And I suppose that's where participation becomes not a good, but because you risk actually doing more damage with that form of participation than no participation, because all you do then is embed cynicism, distrust, and potentially erode any efforts that might be made to achieve, I suppose, equity. So for my part, within any deliberative process, whether it's at a local level, whether it's within, forgive me if I haven't given a more concrete example for this particular topic, but there has to be some recognition of the work that has been done and a response to it. It might be simply that the response is that this is not possible, but with an explanation as to why something is not possible. If you refer back even to the various Irish citizens' assemblies that have taken place, or the precursor, the Convention on the Constitution, there might have been delayed responses, but in the end, there were nonetheless responses. And I think that lies at the heart of any of these processes. If you wish to see them as participatory or deliberative, if there's no commitment to response, then they cannot, to my mind, be genuinely classified as such. They become much more cynical, tokenistic exercises. And I would argue that that's actually damaging to democracy. Yeah.
Thanks, Claudia. That's great. Now I'm conscious of time, but I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Alexandra, there's one here that I think might be for you. Are there any particular examples globally or within Europe of participatory deliberative practices being implemented at the level of local government regarding climate action, citizen engagement on climate education, for example, or the question of transforming energy systems? So you might be aware of any that you could share with us.
I actually think that Claudia will probably be much more aware of some of these. Deliberative innovations are happening all the time. I know, for example, in Belgium, there's a recurring citizens' assembly process, actually, where people actively, place items on the agenda, and then, they discuss these regularly in different formats. And actually, people, they've lowered the age where people can participate. So you have 16-year-olds participating in these processes as well, which is an interesting thing. Normally, for us, for example, from academia, from a research process, you need, ideally to have people over the age of 18 or other. Otherwise, there's a lot of different things in relation to ethics and stuff like that for engaging with younger people. But it's a very interesting aspect of that, climate. And we've seen that young people are becoming more interested and more concerned, and that there's a lot of added issues in relation to young people and their life course, what they can expect of life, given the level of disruption that we need to have in society in general. So yeah. There's other approaches like citizens' juries, world cafes, that bring in the deliberative component as well. And those can be used. What we've tried to do with our tools was to add a sort of a visual component and to look at some of the tools, that you could use to consider those, the views of others, the future, and so on. So thank you. Claudia, if you want to add anything else.
No, I think you've captured a lot of it perfectly. There's been a move a lot in the UK, but across parts of Europe as well, in Germany, to embed kind of climate assemblies and citizens' juries on climate into local authorities and into some regions as well. A really handy resource, if you're interested in this, is the knoca.eu website. It's the knowledge network on climate assemblies. It's a relatively recent project, but they have a good database or a good kind of of descriptions of what's happening. Another really handy resource on this, if people are interested, is participedia.com. It has all the innovations that have taken place worldwide. It's kind of a wiki approach where people put in information about what's been happening in their locality, in their part of the world. So it goes from kind of Alaska down to Australia. There's some really interesting stuff happening in South America traditionally. I suppose under Bolsonaro, things, I suppose democracy hasn't been as strong as it should be under Bolsonaro. A lot of the participatory processes have been kind of lost, but that's what would have been a great home for participatory processes like participatory budgeting, and in India with participatory planning. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time now. One thing I do want to say is, Patrick, I have a comment here saying great equity cartoon, Patrick, and I have to say that all of the visuals in all of the presentations were excellent today. They were really, really nice presentations, so it made it easier, I think, for the audience. But that is a great equity cartoon, Patrick. I do agree. And if you could just really briefly, and I want to get 2 questions in. Somebody says here, Patrick, that it's a very interesting presentation that you gave. You mentioned the need to address entrenched power relationships. What does that mean? Maybe I know that's, I'm asking you to do that in 2 sentences or so, but if you could, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, but I could just give an example of, say, for example, I've been at meetings that are held, consultations with communities. So the idea is that you find a community hall or a school or something, and you call a meeting, say, it could be on catchment management or issues of water in the area. You go to that meeting and you could just think about who might turn up. There might be a handful of people who are interested in water issues and have the time, like the previous person mentioned. People don't have the time. They're struggling, childcare and so on. But you would be pretty sure you would have a representative of the IFA, a representative of maybe the National Federation of Group Water Schemes, a representative of the EPA, representative of LawPro, representative of local council. The point is that all of those people, it's not that they've got interests that aren't valid, but they are professionals. They're paid. Those are organizations that have resources that pay people to attend those meetings, to contribute to those meetings, to shape those meetings, and that is a very basic example of entrenched power relations, because they are organizations with lots of money and resources, whereas most people are doing it voluntarily. And it's so that's a kind of a very crude example. Obviously, it manifests in lots of other ways, but I think that those things are easy to kind of not easy to ignore. They're hard to engage is more the point. How do you start engaging that and taking that seriously? Because I think a lot of the reason people don't turn up or don't engage is partly because they feel that the same voices will be heard, because those are the same voices that constantly are heard because they have the resources, the power, the acumen, so on. So, yeah.
It's great, Patrick. Thank you. And there was a couple of questions I really wanted to get to, but we might try and get them in the second session. There's huge interest in all of your talks. So at this point, I know everybody probably wants to go and boil their kettles, get a quick coffee, get a cup of tea. And I want to thank all of our presenters this morning. They were hugely interesting presentations. I think they've set the scene wonderfully for this afternoon when we actually see the communities and the practitioners speaking about what they're doing. So thank you all. I presume we'll follow up with those questions that are still outstanding. I, for one, really enjoyed the sessions and learned an awful lot. So I'll see you all in the second session. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.